Learning as an adult is hard. But why? Of the thousands of professionals that I've coached, they all tell me that they never have enough time. You feel guilty for not spending your free evenings and weekends with your friends and family, or you feel guilty for not spending that time learning and studying. And even then, it still feels like it's not enough. And it makes sense. We're living now in a time where there is more to learn than there ever has been in human history. The standard to get a job, keep a job, and advance in a career is higher than ever. In fact, there's this theory called the knowledge doubling curve, which says that human knowledge has doubled every century since 1900. And some sources say that human knowledge now doubles every 12 hours. But the lifespan of useful knowledge has also gone down. You could learn something at the start of a degree, and then by the time you get your first job, it may already be irrelevant. So remember when you were a student and you thought that once you graduate, you'd never have to study again? Well, the reality now is more like you have to do an entire degree's worth of studying every few years back to back while working. And this is not just theory. This is the real experience of the modern professional. As a full-time learning coach, I've got hundreds of people that join my program telling me that there is so much new information to learn and they are rapidly falling behind. When I was a medical doctor, I remember working with this training trauma surgeon who would wake up at 4:30 a.m. every day to study a couple of hours before their shift. And then they're working until 11 or 12 at night. So it used to be that you would undergo further learning to advance your career. But now if you can't constantly learn, you can't even maintain your career. So at a time of your life when learning is more important than ever, why is it also harder than ever? Well, part of it is because it's difficult to balance work and life and family and health and learning. But in my experience as a learning coach, there are also a lot of other factors and reasons that make learning much harder than it needs to be, which most of the people I coach haven't really thought about. And the good news is that these other factors have nothing to do with how much time you have or your intelligence. And they're a lot easier to do something about than creating more time. And to understand these factors that make learning as an adult harder than it needs to be, we actually have to go back to how we were taught to learn in school. Learning in school is very different to learning in real life. And one of these big differences is the presence of exams. When you're going through school, the primary objective is to just pass an exam. This is your sort of ultimate goal. And so when you think about the methods and the processes that you learn to get good at this, these are all methods and processes that lead to passing an exam. You also don't really have usually many other responsibilities and burdens that you need to manage your time across. And so the idea of like time or efficiency aren't very important, especially in the early schooling years. And I'm not saying that we should change the schooling system so that every student from the age of 5 years old feels like burdened by time pressure all the time. But what I'm saying is that the methods that we use and learn to get good at to help us overcome these academic school pressures that are around exams are not actually suited for the types of pressures that we have in modern working life. In fact, even using the word modern is kind of a stretch here, because exams actually came around in Western countries in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, there was this reform that happened in the way that the British civil services were selected. And you'd have this group of elites that were already fairly educated, and you'd use these standardized examinations to filter out which one of those would receive certain positions. And that is the origin of examinations. And that filtered its way down through into universities and schools. Now, at the time in the 1800s, there was a lot of emphasis on just how much you know, how much information you have access to. And so a lot of the examinations were based around rote learning and just being able to recall large amounts of information. And also because this is essentially like an employment exam, there wasn't this need to provide great feedback to the students and the candidates and tell them how they can improve for next time. It wasn't really like a learning experience. It was just a filter, a screen. And so there wasn't that much in the way of feedback and growth. Now, obviously, these origins are very different from what we need in the modern world. To be a successful modern professional, you can't just be rote learning things and recalling facts. You need to be able to think creatively and solve problems and use knowledge in diverse ways. And so while modern exams are definitely better than they used to be, there are still some residual similarities. And so when we learn these methods to do well for exams like this, we pick up certain habits like cramming last minute, or just making up for inefficiencies in your method just by increasing the amount of time that you spend studying, going through more rounds of repetition. All strategies that may have been fine for an examination like this, but most of these things are not suitable for a working professional where they have limited time and the volume to learn is just simply too much. And it also doesn't help that most people were never really taught how to learn effectively. Now, schools are not really to blame for this because the learning science just simply wasn't there. Even for myself, I've been doing this for 13, 14 years now, and the learning science had only just gotten to a point where we could say what an effective versus ineffective method of learning really looks like. And so 10 years from now, I'm sure that a lot of the things that I teach now will be just mainstream knowledge that's taught in schools. But that fact doesn't help you like today, with what you need to do. But these methods that we pick up from a very young age just compound and they get carried through into university. And so when we are trying to manage learning as a working professional, we're using outdated teenage study methods to try to overcome adult challenges. And there's actually a particular really problematic belief that this creates, which I've noticed in a lot of the people that I coach. And this is the belief of, I don't have time. And actually, this is a belief that I call a reverse causation. And if you want to be able to have the time to learn and balance all the other things in your life, then you have to understand what is the problem with the statement of, I don't have time to learn. So learning is not a fixed cost. Learning is a process, right? It's a process composed of all these methods and habits that we've picked up over the years. And it is a process that when you add time to it, it results in a certain amount of knowledge. So when you say, I don't have time to learn, what you're actually saying is that the process you're using in the time you have to dedicate doesn't produce the amount of knowledge that you need. But the thing is that time is actually relatively fixed. There's not too much you can do in terms of just increasing the amount of time you have available, but there is a lot you can do in increasing the effectiveness of the process that you use. And regardless of how intelligent you are, optimizing this process is, first of all, something that most people can do. And second of all, once you do it, it often produces an extreme impact. And so when you say, I don't have time to learn, what you're really saying is that my learning is too slow. And this is really the only way that you should look at the problem of learning and being overwhelmed and not having enough time that actually makes sense and will help you. Because time is relatively fixed, and also the amount of knowledge you need to learn is also relatively fixed. If you're studying for an exam, there's so much you need to study. If you're trying to get a promotion or get a new job or do a career change, whatever it is, the amount of knowledge you need to hit is already set. And so if the standard of knowledge you need to reach is fairly fixed, and you're not optimizing the process and the way you're learning is slow, then the only thing that you can do is try to increase and compensate with more time. And this is where the sacrifice comes from. This is time spent away from your family, from your friends, your hobbies, from sleep, all the other things. And this is why slow learning will consume your life. Whereas on the other hand, if you learn more efficiently, so if this becomes more efficient, then this will free up your life because now you're spending less time than you had to before, which means you're getting more free time back. And you're still hitting the level of knowledge that you needed to. So why I call the statement, I don't have time, reverse causation, is because it isn't that you can't learn because you don't have time. It's that you don't have time because you can't learn. So if it's as simple as that, why doesn't everyone just optimize the way that they learn and improve these processes? Well, part of it is because some people don't think about learning as a process, and now you know. But even then, it can be really difficult. Why is that the case? And that is because as an adult with years of learning experience under your belt. That learning experience can actually become debt. So let's say that there's a method that you're using. Let's call it M. And this method allows you to do well in an exam. So let's call that result R. So you use a method to get a certain result. Now, when you get this result, it provides feedback on your methods. And so your methods start iterating and changing to get better at producing the result. And then over time, with enough of this repetition, what happens is that these methods then become habits, which is a good thing in a way because it means that we can use these methods more quickly, more efficiently. They run on autopilot, they're less energy consuming. But as we already discussed, the methods were geared towards the wrong kind of result. This is not the result that we need anymore in adult professional working life. And so the habits that we have formed are actually not serving us anymore. And this becomes really problematic because your habits are linked to the things that you are good at and that you have confidence in. It's linked to your comfort zone. And so we're basically saying that the years of habits that you've built up, that you've become confident with, that you're comfortable with, are not serving you anymore. And therefore, you need to change these habits, which is going to be uncomfortable. And it's going to involve doing something different. And there is a risk that changing these methods is not going to produce the result that you need straight away. And oh, by the way, it's at a time in your life where it is the riskiest to make this change. So not only is it really difficult to retrain these habits, like psychologically, cognitively, it's difficult to unlearn and then retrain a habit. But also we're doing it in an environment where the stakes are higher than it would have been in school or university. And you don't have any time. And actually, it's even worse than that because our experiences also shape our beliefs. So even if we know that our current habits are not serving us, it is our beliefs that tell us how that can change. What are the things that can even be changed? And so if you've never experienced being able to learn really efficiently and cover huge amounts of content in a shorter amount of time and understand it and retain it, it sounds magical. If you've never experienced that and you've never learned that and that's not part of your existing habits, then you don't even know if it's possible for you. So how are you meant to commit to a risky change when you don't even know if that's going to be worth the risk? And this is the reason why when I work with someone, one of the most common pieces of feedback that I get is, I wish I had learned this 10 years ago. And personally, I think there are also a lot of things that I learned, 10 years into my journey that I wish I'd known 10 years ago. And I wouldn't have had to sacrifice so much of my time in the early days figuring all of this stuff out. And I think I was lucky in a lot of ways to have figured it out to a point where I was able to finish medical school and work as a doctor and have a business full time and do my master's and come first in my class for my master's and have lots of free time and discretionary time to do other things. And if some of those insights are things that you wish someone would just tell you, I can just tell you. And the best way to just tell you is in my free weekly newsletter. It's where I share the principles that really changed the way that I think about learning and allowed me to improve. I'm not going to tell you like 2 hacks to triple your flashcard efficiency overnight or to eat blueberries before an exam. I'm focusing on the core principles that really transform the way that I think about learning that have made a lifelong difference for me. So if that's the type of insight that you might be interested in, you may also want to check out my newsletter. I'll leave a link for it in the description below. Now, on that note, there is one belief or habit or perspective on learning that I want to help shift for you right now because it's one of the most common misbeliefs about learning that I notice in the people that I coach. And this belief is around the effective window of learning. Window of learning. When you are a busy working professional with things going on in your life, it's really hard to find a 3 to 4 hour uninterrupted study block, especially if you've got kids. And so adult life gives you 20 minutes here and there, 30 minutes, 1 or 2 hours on a weekend maybe. But your brain has been trained to demand 3 to 5 hour uninterrupted focus blocks. And so the belief that we have that's been kind of trained over the years is that in order for me to learn effectively, I need long uninterrupted study. And while long uninterrupted study is good, There are actually lots of things that allow you to make use of a 20 to 30 minute window. There are techniques like, cognitive bookmarking or micro chunking. Sometimes I talk about this idea of micro layering your learning, and these things do allow you to actually learn effectively when you don't have a lot of time. I remember a international, highly competitive athlete that I coached several years ago, and their training schedule was very, very intense. So they were not only studying full-time to try to enter into medical school, but they were also training 40 hours a week. And so this young athlete was really struggling with learning effectively a huge content volume when they only had sort of, a couple hours on a weekend and then 20 minutes on a commute to and from training on the bus. And so over a couple months, we used techniques like micro-chunking and layering to allow them to be able to learn effectively in that time. So even if they only had 10 minutes, 5 minutes on the toilet, they could use that time effectively. And it wasn't as good as if they did have 3 or 4 hours of uninterrupted study time, but it was a lot better than what they were doing before. Even for myself, these are techniques that I use all the time for my own learning to be able to study when I'm going on a drive somewhere or in the gap between meetings. So the moral of the story, and where I want you to focus on, is not on these techniques. I mean, these are just a few examples, and I've helped many people with this using different techniques. The moral of the story is that it is possible to make it work. And the way that we were able to do that is by starting with challenging some of these non-negotiable assumptions we have about what we need to learn effectively. The only reason I was able to create success in that athlete, or for myself, or for any of the other people that I work with, is because we're coming into it open-minded, willing to challenge these assumptions. And so even if you have been learning a certain way for a very long time, don't assume that that's the way it has to be. In fact, if you're not getting the type of results that you want and the time efficiency that you want, it's almost certain that the process you're using could be better. And I really want you to understand and believe that you are capable of learning much more efficiently than you can now. And it is crucial for you to examine your processes and get better at learning, because in the modern AI age, we are rapidly approaching this bottleneck that I call the book-to-brain barrier. People that can surpass this book-to-brain barrier are the ones who in a AI age will maintain their competitive edge. So I'll quickly explain what this means. Back when books were first invented, information suddenly became publicly much more easily available. And then when internet came around, information was even more available. And so what happened is that the difficulty of accessing information went down from like taking months or weeks down to being able to get it within minutes of a Google search. And now with AI, this has come down even more to seconds. And so there is not much more that this can go. There is diminishing return on how much faster you will be able to just access information. But here's the thing. When books went to internet, it's not like suddenly every single person became like a super highly skilled, ultra valuable employee. No, it just meant that if you can't use the internet, you're going to fall behind. It's the tide that lifted all boats. Everything just went up. At one point, just having books gave you the competitive advantage. But then pretty quickly, having books didn't mean anything. It was about what you knew from that, what you extracted from that, and how you could use that knowledge as an expert. And then when the internet came around, for a period of time, people that could or couldn't use the internet had a competitive advantage. But again, pretty quickly, it just became normal. The advantage wasn't whether you can or can't use the internet. The advantage was, can you extract information from there and build real expertise with the information you have on hand? And it's the exact same thing with AI. Right now, everyone is talking about how to use AI and that it's going to change the world forever, and it will change the world, but not in helping everyone suddenly become an expert. There is honestly really very little difference in being able to access information in minutes versus being able to access it in seconds. The majority of the value that you will be able to provide and that people will seek you for is whether you can take the information and then cross this book-to-brain barrier and get that in your brain as real expertise. It is not about whether you have access to internet or information or AI. It is about what you can do with that, how you interface with that, how you work with that, the type of questions that you ask. And so in an AI age, deep expertise, the ability to know yourself as a human being, how to use all this information is going to become even more valuable. And so if you are right now feeling overwhelmed with how much you need to learn and you're struggling to have the amount of time, or you just feel like maybe you're not smart enough or cut out for it, I want you to remember that learning and covering that and overcoming those challenges is not impossible. If we go back to this diagram here, it's only impossible if you're focusing on the things that you can't control, but the process you can control. And yes, it is difficult and it feels risky and it takes time and it takes dedication, but it is possible. And I would like for each person that resonates with this to start that by challenging your assumptions, challenge your beliefs, think about your learning habits. Changing your habits is hard, genuinely, but it is much harder to be sacrificing everything else in your life every week just to make time for learning. And if you want a good place to start on how you should think about learning and start challenging some of these things, then you can check out this video right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.